How did Adolf Hitler come to power in 1930s Germany? The Treaty of Versailles and Germany's post-war struggles. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919 after World War I, placed the full blame for the war on Germany and its allies. This treaty had devastating consequences for the German economy, military, and national pride. Germany was forced to pay enormous reparations, estimated at around 132 billion gold marks, which placed a huge burden on its already struggling economy. Additionally, the treaty significantly reduced the size of the German military, stripped Germany of its overseas colonies, and led to the loss of large portions of its territory, including areas rich in resources like Alsace-Lorraine and the Saar Basin. These harsh conditions led to widespread resentment and humiliation among the German people. Many Germans viewed the treaty as a dictated peace, believing it to be unfair and overly punitive. This national humiliation created fertile ground for extremist ideologies, particularly those that promised to restore Germany's former glory. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party capitalized on this anger and frustration. They blamed Germany's suffering on the so-called November criminals, the politicians who signed the armistice and the treaty, the Allies, and various scapegoats like the Jews and communists. Hitler promised to defy the Treaty of Versailles, rebuild the German military, reclaim lost territories, and restore national pride, messages that resonated deeply with a population desperate for hope and direction. This historical context set the stage for Hitler's rise, as millions of disillusioned Germans began to turn toward the Nazi Party as a way out of national despair. The Great Depression and economic collapse. The Great Depression, which began in the United States after the 1929 stock market crash, had a catastrophic impact on the global economy, and Germany was hit especially hard. Still recovering from the aftermath of World War I and burdened by the crushing reparations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, Germany's economy was extremely fragile. During the 1920s, the German government had relied heavily on loans from the United States, especially through the Dawes and Young plans, to stabilize its economy and pay reparations. When the American economy collapsed, those loans were recalled, and German industry came to a standstill. As businesses closed and banks failed, unemployment soared. By 1932, nearly 6 million Germans, about 30% of the workforce, were unemployed. Many families were thrown into poverty, unable to afford food, housing, or basic necessities. The Weimar government appeared powerless to stop the economic decline, and confidence in democratic institutions plummeted. This widespread desperation created the perfect storm for radical political movements to gain traction. The Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, offered simple solutions to complex problems. They promised economic revival, full employment, and a return to national greatness. Their message resonated with both the working class, who had lost jobs and savings, and the middle class, who feared further social chaos and communism. Hitler and the Nazis used powerful propaganda, portraying themselves as the only force capable of saving Germany from ruin. They blamed scapegoats, particularly Jews, communists, and the current government, for Germany's problems, offering a sense of unity and purpose to the disillusioned masses. As people lost faith in democracy, they increasingly turned to authoritarian solutions. The economic collapse of the Great Depression didn't just hurt Germany financially, it broke the social and political fabric of the country. It paved the way for extremist parties like the Nazis to grow rapidly in popularity, eventually becoming a dominant political force. The weakness of the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic was established in Germany in 1919, after the fall of the German Empire at the end of World War I. It was intended to be a democratic, parliamentary government, but from the start, it faced enormous challenges. The legacy of the defeat in World War I and the Treaty of Versailles deeply affected the Republic's legitimacy. Many Germans viewed the Weimar government as weak, ineffective, and illegitimate, associating it with the harsh terms of the Versailles Treaty and the humiliating surrender at the end of the war. This undermined trust in the new democratic system. The Weimar Republic faced immediate political instability. It was created in a time of social and political upheaval, with numerous radical factions vying for power, including communists on the far left and nationalists on the far right. These groups, along with violent paramilitary organizations like the Freikorps, led to frequent street battles, protests, and even attempted coups. In the early years, the government struggled to maintain control over these factions and to establish a stable order. One of the major weaknesses of the Weimar Republic was its proportional representation system, which allowed even the smallest political parties to win seats in the Reichstag, parliament. This led to a fragmented political landscape where no single party could command a majority. As a result, coalition governments were formed, often with unstable alliances between parties with vastly different ideologies. These coalitions were prone to infighting and gridlock, preventing effective governance. Moreover, the Weimar Constitution, while progressive in some respects, included provisions that allowed for authoritarian rule. For instance, Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution gave the president the power to rule by decree in times of emergency. This provision was often abused, particularly by President Paul von Hindenburg, who, in the early 1930s, began to govern through a series of emergency decrees instead of relying on the Reichstag. This effectively bypassed democratic processes and created an atmosphere of instability. Economic crises, such as the hyperinflation of the early 1920s and the later Great Depression, further weakened the government's ability to govern. The economic collapse of the early 1930s revealed the government's inability to address the needs of the population, creating widespread dissatisfaction. Many Germans lost faith in the democratic system, seeing it as weak and incapable of providing solutions. This loss of confidence in democratic institutions led to a growing appeal of authoritarian movements, particularly the Nazi Party, which promised strong leadership and stability. Furthermore, the Weimar Republic's handling of political extremism was inadequate. While the government was struggling with internal divisions, Hitler and the Nazi Party were able to capitalize on the discontent by presenting themselves as the solution to the chaos. The inability of the Weimar government to unite the country or confront the rise of the Nazis in a meaningful way contributed significantly to its eventual collapse. Hitler's charisma and Nazi propaganda. Adolf Hitler's rise to power was not only a result of political turmoil and economic despair but also due to his remarkable ability to communicate and manipulate the masses. Hitler was a charismatic orator, and his public speeches were a key tool in the Nazi Party's ascent. He had an exceptional ability to connect with people's emotions, particularly their frustrations, fears, and desires. His personal magnetism and stage presence drew large crowds, and he spoke with conviction and intensity that captivated millions. Through his speeches, Hitler made Germans feel that their suffering was not their fault, but the result of traitors, Jews, and foreign powers. One of Hitler's key rhetorical strategies was to appeal to national pride and restore a sense of hope to a disillusioned population. He presented himself as a strong, decisive leader who could deliver Germany from its economic and political chaos. His speeches often contained dramatic language, invoking the past glories of the German Empire and promising a return to greatness. This was especially attractive to those who had lost confidence in the Weimar government and its inability to address the crises. In addition to his personal charisma, Hitler was extremely skilled in using Nazi propaganda to further his goals. The Nazi Party had a well-developed propaganda apparatus led by Joseph Goebbels, who understood the power of media in shaping public perception. Propaganda was used to glorify Hitler and the Nazi ideology while demonizing their enemies, particularly Jews, communists, and the Weimar government. The Nazis made brilliant use of visual symbols like the swastika, which was meant to symbolize unity, strength, and Aryan racial superiority. The use of the Nazi flag, along with massive rallies and parades, helped foster a sense of collective identity among Germans and reinforce the idea of a unified nation under Hitler's leadership. The Nazi propaganda machine was also highly effective in harnessing the power of radio and film. The regime used these media outlets to broadcast Hitler's speeches and the party's message to millions of Germans. Films such as Triumph of the Will, 1935, directed by Leni Riefenstahl, were meticulously crafted to portray Hitler as the messianic figure capable of leading Germany out of darkness into a new era of greatness. These films depicted grandiose rallies, showcasing Hitler as a leader surrounded by devoted followers, further solidifying his image as the voice of the people. One of the most powerful elements of Nazi propaganda was its ability to scapegoat minorities, particularly the Jewish population. Hitler and the Nazi Party blamed Jews for Germany's economic struggles, the Treaty of Versailles, and the supposed moral decay of society. By portraying Jews as the enemy within, the Nazis created a convenient target for all the frustrations and grievances of the German people. This manipulation helped build support for anti-Semitic policies, which would later lead to the Holocaust. The Nazi propaganda campaign also worked to create a sense of fear among the public, painting communism and the Weimar government as threats to the nation's future. By presenting the Nazis as the only viable solution to the dangers of communism and social upheaval, Hitler was able to galvanize support from the middle class, conservatives, and even some segments of the working class. The Nazis were also adept at simplifying complex issues and offering easy-to-understand solutions. They used slogans like Ein Volk, Ein Reich, Ein Führer, one people, one empire, one leader, to create a sense of unity and loyalty to the Nazi cause. This simplicity, combined with the emotional appeal of their message, made Nazi ideology accessible to a broad segment of the population, from intellectuals to workers, from peasants to businessmen. In summary, Hitler's charisma, combined with the Nazis' skillful use of propaganda, played a critical role in shaping public perception and securing support for the Nazi Party. The power of Nazi propaganda created an image of Hitler as the savior of Germany, a leader capable of restoring national pride, and a force that could overcome the chaos of the Weimar Republic. This psychological manipulation, along with the emotional appeal to national pride and resentment, enabled Hitler to gain widespread support and move closer to power. Political maneuvering and Hitler's appointment as Chancellor in 1933. By the early 1930s, Hitler and the Nazi Party had established themselves as a major political force in Germany. However, despite growing popular support, Hitler was still not in a position to gain power through elections alone. The final steps toward his appointment as Chancellor were shaped by a combination of political maneuvering, backroom deals, and the weaknesses of the Weimar political system. In the 1932 elections, the Nazi Party became the largest party in the Reichstag, securing 37% of the vote, but they still did not have a majority. The Nazis were able to capitalize on widespread public discontent, but they needed to secure support from other political factions to form a coalition government. Hitler's personal ambition and political savvy played a key role in the next phase of his rise to power. At the time, the German political scene was deeply fragmented, with numerous political parties vying for influence. President Paul von Hindenburg, a respected World War I military leader, had been elected in 1925 and was a stabilizing figure in the Weimar Republic. However, by 1932, Hindenburg and his political allies were increasingly desperate to find a solution to the country's instability. Hindenburg's government was marked by frequent use of emergency decrees under Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, which allowed him to bypass the Reichstag and rule by decree. The political elites who were in power at the time, including conservative politicians and businessmen, were deeply concerned about the growing influence of the communists and the potential for a left-wing revolution. While they found Hitler's radical ideas and anti-democratic stance troubling, many saw him as a lesser evil compared to the rise of socialism and communism. They believed that by bringing Hitler into the government, they could control him and use his popularity to stabilize the situation. The turning point came in the summer of 1932. Hitler sought to be appointed Chancellor by Hindenburg, but Hindenburg, who had been initially reluctant to entrust power to him, refused. The Nazis were unable to form a government and were quickly becoming dissatisfied with their lack of progress. In the midst of this stalemate, some influential conservatives and industrialists, many of whom were sympathetic to the Nazis or saw them as a useful tool against the left, began to pressure Hindenburg to make a deal with Hitler. One of the key figures involved in this political maneuvering was Franz von Papen, a former chancellor and conservative politician who believed that he could work with Hitler and limit his power. Von Papen, who had been appointed as vice-chancellor under Hindenburg, brokered a deal in which Hitler would be appointed chancellor, but with several conservative figures, including von Papen himself, filling other key positions in the cabinet. This arrangement was based on the belief that the Nazis could be controlled and used to restore stability, while the conservatives would retain the real power behind the scenes. On January 30, 1933, after intense political bargaining, President Hindenburg, under pressure from conservative elites and business leaders, reluctantly agreed to appoint Hitler as chancellor. This decision was influenced by the belief that the Nazi Party could help restore order and end the chaos of the Weimar period. Hindenburg himself had no great admiration for Hitler, but he saw him as a tool to break the political deadlock and perhaps stabilize the country. However, this move proved to be a grave miscalculation. Despite the conservative presence in the cabinet, once Hitler was appointed chancellor, he quickly moved to consolidate power. Hitler and the Nazis used their new position to push through emergency measures that allowed them to suppress political opposition, control the press, and dismantle the Weimar Constitution. The first step in this process was the Reichstag fire in February 1933, which Hitler used as a pretext to push through the Reichstag fire decree. This decree suspended civil liberties and allowed for the arrest of political opponents, particularly communists. In March 1933, the Enabling Act was passed, which gave Hitler the power to rule by decree, effectively dismantling the democratic structure of the Weimar Republic and granting him dictatorial powers. Once in power, Hitler moved rapidly to eliminate political opposition, consolidate control over the government and the military, and reshape German society along Nazi lines. The Nazis purged political enemies, including communists, socialists, and rival conservative leaders. The regime used violence and intimidation, primarily through the SA, Sturmabteilung, and later the SS, Schutzstaffel, to secure Hitler's total control. In just a few months, Hitler had transformed Germany from a fragile democracy into a one-party dictatorship, marking the end of the Weimar Republic and the beginning of Nazi rule. By 1934, Hitler had consolidated his power and eliminated most potential threats to his rule, including within his own party during the Night of the Long Knives. Thus, Hitler's appointment as chancellor in 1933 was not the result of a popular uprising or a swift electoral victory, but rather a product of behind-the-scenes political maneuvering, elite interests, and the broader instability of the Weimar Republic. Once in power, Hitler's ability to exploit the situation and swiftly eliminate democratic institutions led to his total control over Germany.